Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be starting a brand new retrospective, this time on Smallville. And in this video we're going to be covering Season 1. And because this is the first time I'm discussing Smallville in general on my channel, there's a lot to unpack in this video. So Smallville is a reimagining of Superman's origin story, and centers on a young Clark Kent and his 10-year journey towards becoming Superman. So, quick history lesson before we actually delve into Season 1. This show was created by Alfred Gough and Miles Miller, and initially they pitched it as an origin story for Batman, but Warner Brothers wouldn't allow it. It ran for 10 seasons and is often regarded as one of the best and most groundbreaking superhero TV shows of all time. Just think about it, the Arrowverse, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Netflix's Marvel Universe, none of these shows would be where they are today without Smallville. The show started out as somewhat of a teen drama before evolving into a more mature superhero show. Personally, I've never been a fan of teen dramas. They just never appealed to me, although I will say the old school ones from the late 90s and early 2000s, they're kind of nostalgic for some reason. I mean, the ones we get now take themselves way too seriously. So if I had to pick the best teen drama of all time, I guess it would be Smallville, even though it technically doesn't count. Though I will admit I am a little biased because it's about Superman. What does that say about it? And the interesting thing is, while some people prefer the early seasons when Clark was still in high school, others like myself enjoy the later seasons a little bit more because they delve deeper into the comic book lore, and there's a lot of new takes on members of the Justice League and villains such as Brainiac, Zod, Doomsday, etc. But it didn't necessarily devolve into a Superman show without Superman, even though that's technically what it was. It still felt as if Clark was getting closer and closer towards putting on the cape and becoming Superman, and fully embracing his destiny. And at one point in time, Smallville was actually the longest running fantasy show on the CW network, and I believe in television history as well. That is until Supernatural came around. I do have a full playlist for that show if you're interested. Now as for me, I kind of grew up with Smallville to a certain extent. I watched the first season in 2003, around the time that season 3 was airing in most other countries, and I loved it. I didn't manage to catch every single episode, but honestly with the first season you don't really need to. I watched bits and pieces of season 2, and I remember there being some pretty dark episodes in there. I had seen bits and pieces of seasons 3, 6, and 10 here and there, I guess. I don't really remember. But I stopped watching after season 2 because I was a kid at the time and the show was just getting way too dark and maybe too violent in some instances. And I don't think anybody, let alone myself, could have predicted its longevity. 10 seasons, a full decade. That's a lifetime. So yeah, I assumed that it pretty much ended after maybe about 4 or 5 seasons. But I rewatched it last year when COVID took the world by storm, and I'm glad that I did. It brings back a lot of memories considering I'm a big Superman fan, and I'm glad that a year later I finally get to talk about it on this channel. So to everybody watching this, if you remember the show when you grew up with it, your childhood was awesome. And granted, while this show for the most part holds up pretty well today, there are some aspects of it that don't. Some of the production values and the visual effects, the overuse of slow motion, which was clearly inspired by The Matrix, some of the storylines, whether overarching or self-contained, and the corny Dawson's Creek-like moments of the early seasons. Okay, so now that the history lesson is over, let's delve into Season 1. Is it good? Yes, in fact it's great, and it's a great start to the show in general. So let's get into it. So first of all, let's talk about the pilot episode. It is without a doubt one of the best pilot episodes I've ever seen. Now, if you know about how Clark Kent came to Earth, it was around the time when Krypton was destroyed and Jor-El sent him to Earth and Jonathan and Martha Kent found him. You know the story, you know how it goes. But the addition of a meteor shower, which apparently is a deviation from the comics, added an extra layer to this because it had a long-lasting impact on the rest of the show. And many civilians in Smallville were affected by the dozens and dozens of meteor rocks that all contained kryptonite, resulting in them gaining all types of weird supernatural abilities. And this laid the groundwork for the show's Monster of the Week format, which in the case of Smallville is referred to as the Freak of the Week format, because the people who are infected by the meteors are referred to as meteor freaks. So if you enjoyed shows like The X-Files or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or even Fringe, I guess, I'm not sure what that show's all about, but apparently it's like The X-Files, then you'll definitely enjoy Smallville. Although in the later seasons it does become more and more serialized. And the pilot episode as a whole pretty much sets up everything for the show perfectly. It establishes the meteor shower and the impact it had on Smallville in general, the introductions to Clark Kent, Jonathan and Martha Kent, Lex Luthor, Lionel Luther, and some other characters. It plays out like a typical Monster of the Week episode, and even as a Monster of the Week episode, it's great. But I also noticed something that practically nobody talks about when it comes to the pilot. The similarities to 9/11. Yeah, that 9/11. 20 years later and we're still talking about it. Wow. Now obviously this episode was conceived sometime before 9/11, and it premiered a month after 9/11, which took place on September 11th, and Smallville premiered in October, about 20 years ago to be exact. Damn, I feel old. It just seems like a very odd coincidence to me, because the meteor shower has consequences very similar to that of 9/11. It caused a lot of destruction in Smallville, similar to the destruction caused by 9/11, and meteor freaks are often discriminated against, or they're simply captured by Luthor Corp and experimented on. It reminds me of how much Islamophobia took place in the 2000s because of 9/11. And back then, countries like the United States were a bit more conservative. So when it came to foreign prisoners, especially Islamic prisoners, the government basically condoned the use of torture as an interrogation technique. So the whole thing is an unintentional allegory for 9/11 and the Islamophobia that became a product of it. But enough about all that. Let's talk about the characters. So first of all, we have the man himself, Clark Kent, played by Tom Welling. So in season 1, Clark Kent is basically trying to find his place in this world after learning that he's practically an alien from another planet. He doesn't get to find out everything about his lineage just yet. They spread it out across the show, and at some point Jor-El will show up, obviously, but we'll talk about that in one of my future reviews. Another thing about Clark is the fact that the show made him a relatable character, not because of what he was capable of with his abilities, but because of how they affected his personal life. And he's pretty much the equivalent of a child with special needs. You know, children with like mental health issues. You know, ADHD and autism and Asperger's syndrome and all that kind of stuff. Because he feels like he doesn't belong. And children with mental health issues, at some point they're gonna feel the same way. I mean, me personally, I've always felt like I've never belonged in this world. But I was wrong. I mean, there are people out there who care about me. You know who you are. I love you. At the beginning of the show, he's already discovered a few of his powers, but has yet to discover more of them, not only in this season, but throughout the series in general. He's in love with Lana Lang, even though she's with someone else, and he begins a friendship with none other than Lex Luthor. It's a pretty interesting concept, but we'll get to that later. And he spends the entire season basically hiding his secret from everybody, except for Jonathan and Martha, who found him in the first place. So going back and rewatching this season can be a bit frustrating because of that. Oh, he has to hide his secret from this person and that person. Oh, he has to run off and make sure everyone's oblivious to his abilities. And speaking of Tom Welling is the best Clark Kent since Christopher Reeve, in my opinion. He wasn't one of my absolute favorites initially, but upon rewatching the show, he grew on me quite a bit. And while he never actually played Superman on the show, the fact of the matter is, if you care about Clark Kent, then you will root for Superman. So this was a fantastic depiction of Clark Kent, and this was a solid beginning to his character arc throughout the show. And as I recall, Tom Welling was asked at a panel what his favorite aspect of Clark Kent's character arc is throughout the show, and he said, the entire show, pretty much everything. Well, it makes sense, you know? It had its stumbles here and there, but it was great for the most part. Then we have Lana Lang, played by Kristen Kruok. Lana is one of the most hated characters on the show, and I can understand why. But she wasn't that bad in my opinion, and Kristen Kruok did the best she could with what she had to work with, even if it wasn't always good. So Lana lost both of her parents in the meteor shower, and even though it's not necessarily Clark's fault, he still feels guilty about it, and it's because of this that he does his best to hide his secret from her. Though in retrospect, he could have just told her that he was a meteor freak. I think she would have understood. I don't know. And it's because of all of this that she's very empathetic towards people. She's in a relationship with Whitney Fordman. Whitney, who's played by Eric Johnson, begins to grow jealous of Lana's friendship with Clark, though he turns out to be a bit more sympathetic than Clark expected as the season progresses. Chloe Sullivan is played by Allison Mack, who we now know for, the NXIVM scandal. Anyway, back to Chloe. Chloe is the editor of the school's newspaper. She has very journalistic ambitions, and she's all about exposing falsehoods and finding out the truth, even if it means creating tension among her friends. She even created a mural called The Wall of Weird, which consists of newspaper articles about incidents linked to various meteor freaks and the meteor shower in general. And The Wall of Weird becomes a prominent source of information throughout the first 4 seasons. Her friendship with Clark in particular is one of the best friendships in the entire show. And having not read the comics, I was surprised to find out that Chloe was an original character created specifically for the show. And upon rewatching it, I was able to separate the art from the artist. You know, putting aside what Allison Mack was up to all these years, I was just able to enjoy the character of Chloe for who she was. There's also Pete Ross, who's played by Sam Jones III. He's also one of Clark's friends, and he holds a personal grudge against the Luthers, who I'll get to in a bit. And now for some of the most important characters on the show, the Kents and the Luthers. The characters who played a pivotal role in defining Clark Kent. Firstly, the Kents. There's Jonathan Kent, played by John Schneider. Jonathan is very, very protective of Clark when it comes to his secret, and he's also very wary of Clark's interactions with the Luthers. And just like any father would for their son, even though he's technically Clark's adopted father, he would do anything, literally anything, to protect Clark. Martha Kent, who's played by Annette O'Toole, is always giving Clark and Jonathan advice on Clark's abilities, just as any ordinary mother would give advice to their children and their husbands. This was pretty much the foundation for her character, and in later seasons the writers would diverge from the source material and take her in directions that I found to be interesting. And fun fact, Annette O'Toole previously played Lana Lang in Richard Lester's Superman 3. I think she was perfectly cast in that role, and despite that movie's reputation, I actually enjoyed it. And last but not least, the true stars of this show were the Luthers. Firstly, there's Lex Luthor, who's played by Michael Rosenbaum. Michael Rosenbaum is, in my opinion, the best and most realistic Lex Luthor to date. He's the son of Lionel Luther, a billionaire, which practically makes him a billionaire as well. But despite his lavish lifestyle, he envies the simpler life that Clark has, especially after meeting him for the first time, and the way these two meet and become friends is actually quite fascinating. However, the incident that led to the two of them meeting does make Lex a little bit suspicious as to what Clark is capable of. And throughout the show, his curiosity only grows into an obsession. Smallville did a great job in taking this character and making him as three-dimensional as possible. And in many ways, this isn't just an origin story for Superman. This is an origin story of Lex Luthor, because he started out being Clark's best friend, and by the end, he's Clark's worst enemy. and he's the Lex Luthor that we all recognize. And let's not forget Lionel Luther, the billionaire CEO of Luthor Corp, who is in fact my favorite character in the entire series. Lionel Luther is played by John Glover, and John Glover was a guest star for season 1, but remained a series regular for most of the show. Lionel Luther is practically an original character created for the show. Although Lex's parents were mentioned in the comics, they weren't actual developed characters. And Lionel Luther is so complicated and complex and nuanced that I couldn't help but feel excited every time he was on screen. In this season, he hires Lex to run a fertilizer plant that operates in Smallville, and from a business perspective, you can tell that they have their differences. And their father and son relationship is without a doubt one of the strongest relationships in the history of the show, and possibly in all of television. So yeah, a lot of characters to talk about, and there'll be more as the show progresses. So let's talk about some other good stuff. Now the show starts out as a straightforward Monster of the Week series, and there's some cool standalone episodes in this season. For example, there's Jitters, an episode starring the Candyman himself, Tony Todd, as a man who has an extreme case of Tourette's caused by the meteor rocks. Kinetic, which is about a group of ex-jocks who commit crimes using kryptonite-saturated tattoos to their advantage. And my personal favorite being Stray. Stray is about a kid named Ryan who can read people's minds. I had this episode on VHS for a couple of years and I was absolutely obsessed with it, so when I ended up rewatching it last year, it just gave me goosebumps. And what I've learned from it is that no matter who you are or what you're going through, you're not alone, and you never will be. As far as the visual effects are concerned, while they definitely haven't aged well, they were amazing for their time, and I was shocked to find out that Neil Blumkamp of District 9 fame was an animator on season 1. I think he did a really good job. Well done, Neil. The action scenes, they're a lot more straightforward compared to what the later seasons have to offer, which, were more ambitious, especially since Clark is learning to master his abilities. I'm also glad that the season aimed for a light-hearted and fun tone, allowing for younger audiences, like 9 and 10-year-olds, to experience Smallville. I remember watching the show for the first time when I was about 6, 7, and I was more interested in the Monster of the Week kind of stuff, not really the overarching storylines, whereas today I'm the polar opposite when it comes to episodic TV shows. Though I will admit, it does lead to some corny teen melodrama here and there that I didn't take issue with, but I'm sure some people will. It's very reminiscent of Dawson's Creek, and let's face it, Dawson's Creek hasn't aged very well. And the finale did something a little bit different from most of the episodes, and it ended on this pretty cool cliffhanger that left a lot of loose ends for season 2. Now my biggest complaint with season 1 is the Monster of the Week structure. There's too many Monster of the Week episodes, and they overshadow the few story arcs we get here and there. Plus, they all have similar storytelling structures to the point where even the good episodes are very formulaic and predictable. And I got tired of this format about halfway through, and apparently I wasn't alone in that. On top of the formulaic nature of the episodes, as well as the fact that the story arcs were overshadowed by this format, there's a good chunk of episodes you can actually get away with skipping that add nothing to the plot whatsoever. I guess the writers decided to start the show out like this because they were still kind of dipping their toes in the water, trying to figure out what can we do with this particular property. The show was still finding its feet in this first season, and the producers had acknowledged the criticisms with this format, and they vowed to make sure that the later seasons were more serialized. And another issue is that some episodes aren't particularly good. Some of them are good in concept, but kind of poor in execution. I mean, the second episode, I forgot what it's called. Oh yeah, that episode. That's possibly the worst episode in the entire season, but the villain in it is quite interesting. So I'm also going to present you with a watch guide for each and every season of Smallville, because there are some episodes you need to watch, some episodes you can watch if you want to, and some episodes that are worth skipping altogether. So let's get into it. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Season 1 of Smallville. It's a great start to the show, even if it's not perfect. So next time we're going to look at Season 2. So thank you all for watching. Please be sure to like the video, share it, and subscribe. Hit the notification icon. Be safe during this time, and I'll see you soon.